Karen had always been known for her short fuse, but today felt like one of those days where the fuse was almost non-existent. The weight of the world seemed to press down on her shoulders as she made her way through the dreary prison halls. Everything about this place felt suffocating. The stale air, the cold concrete walls, and the echoes of distant voices made it all feel more like a nightmare than a visit to someone she was supposed to care about. She was here to visit her cousin, someone who had found themselves on the wrong side of the law. But it wasn't just the situation that bothered Karen, it was the entire process. She had arrived hours earlier, only to find herself stuck in a maze of bureaucracy, constantly being shuffled from one guard to another, asked for the same information over and over again. The oppressive fluorescent lights in the visitation room did nothing to help her already sour mood. She was tired, frustrated, and angry, and the smallest inconvenience seemed to set her off. As she walked down the long corridor, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She could feel the heat building in her chest, her heart rate quickening. Every step she took was a reminder of how little control she had over her life at that moment. She hated feeling this helpless, trapped by circumstances she had no power over. Karen had always been a fighter, someone who pushed back when she was cornered. But today, she felt like the universe had teamed up against her. As she turned the corner, she spotted him. A guard standing next to a door, his posture stiff and perfect. He had his arms crossed, his gaze cold as it swept over the hallway. He looked like the kind of man who took his job seriously, maybe a little too seriously. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark, neatly combed hair and an aura of authority that radiated from him. He wore the standard prison guard uniform, dark green with a badge pinned to his chest, the kind of uniform that signified power and control. The fact that he looked like he could have been carved from stone didn't help her growing agitation. Karen was already in the middle of her own inner rant about the unfairness of the whole situation when the guard's eyes met hers. His stare was piercing, unwavering. Something about the way he looked at her made her feel even more irritable, as though he was judging her, scrutinizing her every move. She could feel the heat rising in her chest again, and before she could stop herself, the words spilled out of her mouth, sharp and biting. "Are you seriously going to stand there and do nothing?" Karen snapped, her voice dripping with frustration. She wasn't even sure who she was speaking to anymore, the guard or the universe itself. She was so caught up in her emotions that she didn't even realize how close she had gotten to him. The guard didn't respond. He didn't even flinch, as if her words had rolled off him like water off a duck's back. He simply gave her a look that didn't say anything but somehow said everything. It was the kind of look that made her feel both small and foolish, as if she had just made a fool of herself by reacting so impulsively. Karen's temper, however, didn't allow her to retreat. Her frustration had built up so much that she felt like she needed to release it somehow, like a pressure cooker that was about to explode. Without thinking, she swung her hand up, her palm open and her fingers stiff with the intensity of her anger. The slap landed with a loud crack, the sound reverberating off the prison walls. For a moment, there was complete silence. The world seemed to stop. Karen stood frozen, her hand still raised in the air, as though she were still mid-motion, as though she could take it all back, but it was too late. The impact of her slap had already landed. And yet the guard didn't move. He didn't shout, didn't raise his hand to his cheek, didn't even acknowledge the slap in the way Karen expected. Instead, he just looked at her, his eyes cold and unfazed. It was as if nothing had happened at all. His face was still stone-faced, no emotion flickering across his features. Karen's breath caught in her throat. the reality of what she had just done beginning to sink in. What had she been thinking? Her mind scrambled for an explanation, for a reason why she'd let her temper get the best of her, but no justification came. She had slapped him, and now she had to face the consequences. Her heart raced, her hands trembling as she tried to gather herself. She had been ready for a confrontation, expecting him to yell at her or retaliate. But this was not at all what she had imagined. There was no explosion of anger, no harsh words, just silence. For a moment, she thought maybe she had imagined the whole thing. Maybe it hadn't even happened. But when she saw the faintest trace of his hand moving towards his cheek, she knew that it hadn't been a dream. The slap had left its mark both on him and on her. The guard's eyes, which had once been cold and impassive, now shifted slightly. There was something in his gaze that made Karen's stomach drop. It was a flicker of recognition, something that caught her off guard. She couldn't place it at first, but it gnawed at the back of her mind. Her mind raced through 1,000 different scenarios, none of which made any sense. How could someone be so unaffected by such an obvious show of aggression? How could he not react? But even as she struggled to understand, she felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't know it yet, but this guard wasn't just any stranger in a uniform. He was someone from her past, someone she had long forgotten, someone she had never expected to encounter in a place like this. As her thoughts swirled, the silence was broken by his voice, deep, calm, and steady. "You don't remember me, do you?" Karen blinked, her heart skipping a beat. The words were soft, but they hit her like a ton of bricks. She stared at him, trying to piece together what was happening. Her eyes scanned his face, searching for something familiar. And then, suddenly, it hit her. The sharp jawline, the dark eyes that now held something far more than indifference. She knew him. This was Alex, the same Alex she had known as a teenager, the same Alex she had lost touch with after everything fell apart, the boy who had once been her closest friend, the one who had always looked out for her, before life took him down a darker path. The flood of memories hit her in an instant, overwhelming her with the realization of who he was. She had slapped him, of all people, her old friend, and in that moment, she regretted it more than anything she had ever done. But Alex didn't show any sign of recognition in his eyes, not yet. He just stood there, watching her with a gaze that was no longer just cold, but something else, something harder, something distant. And Karen knew with a sinking feeling that her life was about to change in ways she hadn't expected. The moment those words left his mouth, everything around Karen seemed to shift. The air in the corridor felt heavier, the fluorescent lights above suddenly too bright, and for a brief second she felt dizzy. She wanted to look away, to escape, but her eyes were locked onto his. His voice, the voice that once had been filled with warmth and comfort when they were younger, was now cool and detached, like it had been sharpened over years of silence and distance. She couldn't escape the reality of the situation. She had just slapped him, and now she was face to face with the very person she had tried so hard to forget. Alex's face, though, remained neutral. He didn't flinch or react with anger like she had expected. Instead, there was something unreadable about him. Karen searched his features, desperately trying to find any hint of the person she used to know, the boy who had been her confidant, her protector. He had always been the calm one, the one who kept her grounded, even when everything around them was falling apart. But that boy, that version of Alex, seemed to have disappeared somewhere along the way. The memories started to flood Karen's mind like a rushing tide. She remembered the afternoons they spent together as teenagers, talking about their dreams, their hopes for the future. They had been inseparable, once upon a time. He had always been there when she needed him, a constant in a world that often felt chaotic. She could still picture him clearly, with his messy, dark hair, those deep brown eyes that always seemed to understand her without words, and the way he could make her laugh even on the worst days. But then life had pulled them in different directions. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just small things, gradually growing apart as time went on. Karen had gotten involved with people who weren't the best influence, chasing after things that led her down the wrong path. Alex, however, had always been the level-headed one. He had his own struggles, but he never let them show. She had lost track of him, slowly but surely, until one day he was just gone. The phone calls stopped. The messages stopped. She assumed he had moved on, left everything behind, and built a new life for himself. But here he was, standing in front of her, a prison guard, a man who had clearly changed. The soft, kind-hearted Alex she had known was nowhere to be found. In his place was someone different, someone hardened by time, by choices, by life's cruel lessons. He was still physically the same, tall, strong, his jawline sharp as ever, but there was a coldness in his eyes now, a hardness in his expression that she hadn't seen before. It made her feel like a stranger in his presence. For a moment, Karen stood frozen in place, trying to make sense of everything. Her heart was racing, her breath shallow, and her mind was in turmoil. She had just slapped him. She had just struck the one person who, in a sense, had always looked out for her. She wanted to apologize, to explain herself, but the words stuck in her throat. How could she possibly explain what had just happened? How could she apologize for something so impulsive, so reckless? She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The tension in the air was palpable, and she could feel herself unraveling in front of him. The silence stretched on, unbearably long, before she finally managed to find her voice. Alex. The name felt foreign on her tongue, like it had been years since she had spoken it aloud. I didn't mean to... But she couldn't finish the sentence. The words felt empty, hollow. How could she make up for what she had just done? How could she erase the slap, the anger, the rashness? How could she undo the years of separation and distance that had built up between them? Alex didn't speak right away, and Karen couldn't bring herself to meet his eyes. She stared down at the ground, her hands wringing nervously in front of her. The guilt was suffocating her. She had always been the kind of person who had trouble controlling her emotions, but this was different. This was a person from her past, someone she had once cared about deeply, and now she had just slapped him as if he were a complete stranger. It felt like a betrayal, even though she had no idea what had happened to him in the years since they had last spoken. Finally, Alex broke the silence, his voice steady, but laced with an emotion that Karen couldn't quite place. You don't recognize me, do you? The question hit her like a slap in its own right. Of course she recognized him. He had always been Alex, the boy who used to make her laugh, the boy who had promised to always look out for her. But now, standing before her in a prison uniform, he seemed like someone entirely different. She had no idea how to respond to him, how to acknowledge the fact that this man, who had once been a part of her life, was now standing in front of her in a place she never thought she'd find him. She shook her head, the words still lodged in her throat. I don't know. She tried to look at him, but the shame in her chest made it impossible to make eye contact. You look so different. Alex's lips curled into the faintest of smiles, but it was nothing like the carefree smiles they had shared all those years ago. This one was different, tinged with something more serious, more distant. "Yeah," he said softly. "I've changed." Karen wanted to say something, wanted to ask him what had happened, how he ended up here, but the words wouldn't come. She felt as though she had no right to ask him about his life. Not after everything. Not after everything that had happened between them, and the years of silence that had followed. Instead, she stood there in silence, the weight of her own mistakes pressing down on her. This wasn't just about the slap. It was about everything, the years they had lost, the things she had done that had pushed him away. This was the moment when everything came crashing down. The person she had once known had been replaced by someone she didn't fully understand anymore. And somehow, she had become a stranger to him as well. Alex seemed to sense her struggle, his expression softening just a little, though there was still an edge of something unreadable behind his eyes. He didn't seem angry, not really, but there was a quiet sadness in his gaze that made Karen's chest tighten. He wasn't the same Alex, but then again, neither was she. They had both changed in ways neither of them could have predicted. "I guess that's what time does to people, huh?" Alex said, his voice low, almost to himself. He paused for a moment before adding, "People change, Karen. They have to." His words lingered in the air between them, a reminder of how much time had passed and how much they had both gone through in the years since they last spoke. They had both lived lives that had shaped them, turned them into people they didn't even recognize sometimes. And now, here they were, facing each other once again, but this time as two different people. Karen didn't know what to say. There was too much to say, and she had no idea where to start. Her mind was spinning, and her emotions were a whirlwind. She had no idea how to repair what had been broken, how to make up for the years of silence, or how to undo the damage she had just caused with one impulsive action. But one thing was clear. She had a long road ahead of her, and the person standing before her was no longer the one she had once known. And yet, despite everything, he was still the same Alex, in some ways. And that realization, more than anything, made her regret everything even more. Karen stood there, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The awkwardness between her and Alex was palpable, and the years of distance, silence, and regret seemed to close in around her like a heavy fog. She could feel the anger and frustration bubbling beneath the surface, but they weren't directed at Alex. No, the anger was aimed squarely at herself. The slap. What had she been thinking? Why had she let herself get so overwhelmed by emotions that she had acted impulsively without considering the consequences? But as she stood there in the sterile, cold environment of the prison, facing Alex for the first time in years, she realized just how much she had been carrying all this time. Her life had taken a different trajectory, and she had done things she wasn't proud of, that had pushed people away. But none of it, none of her mistakes, felt as heavy as this moment, as the realization that she had hurt someone who once meant so much to her. Her mind wandered back to the past, to the times when things were simpler. She and Alex used to talk about their futures, about all the things they would do, the places they would go, the people they would become. They had shared hopes, dreams, fears, vows, and ambitions, and in each other they had found someone who truly understood them. They had been close, inseparable in fact, until life had pulled them in different directions. Alex had stayed grounded, focused on his path, while Karen had fallen into bad habits, surrounded herself with the wrong people, and slowly drifted from the person she once was. And now, here they were, at this moment in time. And Karen couldn't help but wonder, how did it all go so wrong? How had she become someone who slapped the very person who once cared for her? The answer was painfully simple, though. She had changed too, and not for the better. She had allowed herself to get lost in her own insecurities, her own rage at the world, at her circumstances. And she had turned that anger outward onto people who didn't deserve it. Especially Alex. The silence between them stretched on, thick and heavy, like an impenetrable wall. Neither of them seemed to know what to say next. Karen wanted to apologize again, but she feared the words wouldn't be enough. What could she possibly say to make this right? How could she explain to him the anger, the frustration, the years of pain that had built up inside of her and led to this explosive moment? Alex, for his part, hadn't moved, hadn't shown any real emotion since she slapped him, but his eyes were different now. No longer were they the eyes of a stranger. Now, they seemed to hold something else, something softer. There was a quiet sadness in them, but also a flicker of something else, something Karen couldn't quite grasp. Maybe it was pity, maybe it was sympathy, or maybe, just maybe, it was a flicker of the old connection they used to have, buried beneath the years of separation. "Why are you really here, Karen?" Alex's voice broke through the tension, cutting through the fog of silence. The question was simple, but it was loaded with meaning, and Karen knew it. She took a deep breath and looked at him, her hands trembling slightly. She had to make a choice. She could walk away, keep her distance, act like everything that had happened between them didn't matter. Or she could try to confront the reality of the situation, try to make amends for the past. The truth was, she didn't even know where to start. But she couldn't let this moment slip away, not without trying. "I came here for closure," Karen said, her voice shaky but determined. She could feel the vulnerability in her words, but it was the truth. "I came here because I needed to face the consequences of everything I've done. I needed to see you, to understand what happened." Alex's gaze softened for a moment, but then he sighed, his eyes falling to the ground. He seemed to be contemplating her words, his brow furrowing slightly, before he looked up at her again. "Closure?" he asked, his tone barely above a whisper. "You think you can just walk in here and get that? After everything? After all these years?" Karen flinched at his words, feeling the sting of truth. She had expected something like this, but hearing it still hit her hard. She had thought maybe, just maybe, Alex would be forgiving. But now she wasn't sure what she had been expecting from him. An apology, a warm embrace. She realized how naive that was, how selfish. After all, she had been the one who walked away, who shut him out without so much as a second thought. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said quickly, her voice cracking with emotion. "I know what I did. I know I've hurt you. But I need you to know that it wasn't just about you. I've been hurting for a long time and I've made a lot of mistakes. I wasn't the person I used to be and I didn't know how to deal with it. So I ran." The words felt like they had been building inside of her for so long, and now that she was finally speaking them, they poured out in a rush. She wasn't sure if Alex was even listening, but it didn't matter. She needed to say them. Needed to let him know that she was sorry. That she wasn't proud of who she had become. Alex stayed silent for a moment, his gaze flicking toward the ground again, his arms folded across his chest. The tension between them was unbearable, but Karen couldn't bring herself to look away. She needed to say everything now, to finally put the past behind her, no matter what that meant. "You weren't the only one who changed, Karen," Alex finally said, his voice quieter now, but filled with something deeper, something that sounded like pain. "You think I wanted this? To be here, like this, in this place. You think this is the life I wanted? He motioned toward the sterile environment around them, the grey walls, the cold metal bars that separated them. This wasn't the plan. I didn't want to end up here. I didn't want to lose you. But life, it just kept throwing curveballs. I had to fight, and sometimes you have to do things you never imagined you'd do to survive. Karen's heart clenched as she listened to him speak. She could hear the rawness in his voice, the pain he was trying so hard to keep hidden beneath the surface. It was almost like he had been holding on to this for all these years, too. But she wasn't sure if it was just regret or something else, the same thing she had been feeling in the pit of her stomach since she saw him. "I didn't know," Karen whispered, her voice breaking as the weight of everything settled on her shoulders. "I didn't know you were struggling. I didn't know how hard it was for you." Alex's eyes softened, but there was a stillness about him, a calm that came from years of hardship. He was different now, and Karen could see it. He had grown in ways she couldn't fully understand, but the truth was, she had grown too. And yet the distance between them seemed wider than ever. "I didn't want you to know," Alex said, his tone gentle but resolute. "I didn't want anyone to see the cracks. Not even you. But I guess the cracks are showing now, aren't they?" Karen didn't know how to respond. She felt as if everything she had known about their relationship was slipping through her fingers. This was not the reunion she had envisioned. She had imagined something different, something easier, more forgiving, but life wasn't like that. Relationships weren't like that. And sometimes, forgiveness wasn't something you could just expect. It had to be earned. She couldn't just assume Alex would forgive her for the past, for the slap, for the years of silence. She had to prove that she had changed too, that she was willing to make things right, even if that meant facing the hardest truths. The silence between them lingered, stretching into something heavy and unspoken. Karen felt it in her chest, a weight pressing down, making it harder to breathe. She could see the pain in Alex's eyes, the years of struggle etched into his face. It wasn't just about what had happened today, it was about everything. The past, the choices, the regrets, and the fact that, in some cruel twist of fate, they had been brought together again in the most unexpected way. Karen wanted to say something, anything, that would make it better. But she knew there were no magic words, no quick fixes for wounds that had been left to fester for so long. All she had was the truth, and for once, she was willing to lay it bare. "I never meant for things to end up like this," she admitted, her voice raw. "I never wanted to hurt you. I was just lost. I still am." Alex let out a small breath, something that almost sounded like a bitter laugh. He leaned against the wall, crossing his arms over his chest as if bracing himself. "We were both lost," he said, his tone distant. "But you left, Karen. You walked away, and I had to pick up the pieces. I had to figure it out on my own." His words stung, but she knew they were true. She had run, she had abandoned him when he needed her most, when everything had started to fall apart, and now, standing in front of him, she realized just how much she had underestimated his pain. She had thought she was the only one who had suffered, but Alex had been carrying his own burden all along. "I know," she whispered. "I was a coward. I didn't know how to face things, so I took the easy way out. But it wasn't easy, Alex. It was hell." He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then finally, he sighed. "Yeah, I get that." There was no anger in his voice now, just exhaustion. Karen could see it in his posture, in the way his shoulders slumped slightly. He had been fighting battles she knew nothing about, and she hated herself for not being there. They stood there for what felt like forever, the air thick with unspoken words. And then, slowly, Alex shifted his weight and looked her in the eye. "So why now?" he asked. "Why come back after all this time?" Karen swallowed hard. She had asked herself the same question 100 times before stepping into the prison. "Because I couldn't keep running," she said. "Because I needed to see you. I needed to know if there was still anything left." Alex's gaze didn't waver. "And if there isn't?" Karen's heart clenched. She had to be ready for that possibility. That was the risk in coming back. She might find out that it was too late, that the damage had been done, and there was nothing left to salvage. "Then I'll live with it," she admitted. "But I had to try." Alex was quiet for a long time. Then, something in his expression shifted. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it wasn't anger either. It was something in between, something uncertain. "You can't change the past, Karen," he said softly. "Neither can I. But maybe we can figure out where we stand now." Hope flickered in her chest. Fragile, but real. She nodded, swallowing back the lump in her throat. "I'd like that." A small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of Alex's lips. "Then let's start there." It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a beginning. And for the first time in a long time, Karen felt like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't lost anymore.